Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center of Innovation in Campus Mental Health webinar series. We're just going to take a minute for everyone to slowly come in before we get started. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. The topic that we're going to be exploring today is two-eyed seeing, supporting Indigenous students' mental health. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. All participants are on mute while we are on the call, so if you have any questions or any concerns that you want to raise, feel free to type it into either the chat or the question function. We're going to start taking up questions probably around 1:40, 1:45, depending on how the presentation runs. The webinar is being recorded and is going to be made available on our website. The slides are also available for download. If you look under the handouts function, you should be able to download a PDF of the slides. An email is also going to go out tomorrow with all of the links to the recording and the slides. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes to complete it as the feedback is really valuable to us. And I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Perlin Ng. For those of you who have never seen any of our webinars before, I am the Research and Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the Center. And joining us today is Jamie Warren and Lorraine Hale, who are the superstars of today's webinar. So I'm just going to hand it over to them right now.
Wache, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jamie Warren. I am Michigan Cree, a member of Moose Cree First Nation on Treaty 9 territory on my mother's side, as well as English and Scottish ancestry on my father's side. I work as an Indigenous student counselor at Niagara College, where I offer personal counseling, mental health, and cultural support for our Indigenous students here at Niagara College, as well as academic accommodations and counseling for essentially all NC students. I'm very grateful to be facilitating today's webinar from the shared territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples, as well as other nations.
Fago, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lorraine Hale, and I am of mixed ancestry. I am English, Irish, Cherokee, and Haudenosaunee. I have worked with First Nation communities for about 20 plus years, and the past 10 years have witnessed the expansion of my work into populations of Métis and Inuit nations as well. I am currently a counselor with Fleming College, and I live and work on the traditional Mississauga lands in the territory covered by the Williams Treaties. Understanding that today many of you are joining us from across the province and maybe beyond our provincial borders. These are all meeting places of many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. So we are grateful to have you all joining us, and we're really grateful for this opportunity to gather in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect.
So to prepare you for what we're going to be talking about today, today's webinar will be focusing on two key areas. So first, we are going to be highlighting the significance of Indigenous student mental health within the context of post-secondary institutions. More specifically on Canada's new baby boom, our ethical responsibilities as helpers, so referring to our code of ethics and our standards of practice, as well as with respect to responding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to actions. And then the second half of the webinar will provide an overview of what exactly Indigenous wellness may look like when it comes to supporting the mental health of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit post-secondary students. And then at the end of our webinar, we will dedicate the remaining time left to answering any questions that you may have related to this topic.
Okay, so to get us started, as you can see from this slide, There are a number of factors impacting our population growth in Canada. So Indigenous people in Canada currently account for 4.9% of the total population. But we have witnessed a significant increase in the past 12 years with the growth of 42.5%. This is 4 times the growth rate for non-Aboriginal populations. And it is anticipated that in the next 20 years, this population will likely exceed 2.5 million. This means that there is increasing likelihood that our offices and institutions will be hosting individuals from First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities and ancestry. So our goal today is to foster a landscape to recognize and begin the journey ahead in striving to respond to this changing climate and emerging needs.
So in response to the rapid growth of Indigenous peoples in Canada, especially with our Indigenous youth, it is important to recognize that our communities are incredibly diverse. And this is in terms of our nations, our histories, our languages and dialects, our regions, and even in the way that we practice and follow by Indigenous protocols. Just to give you an example, when I first moved to the current territory that I live and work on, I remember one of the first things that I noticed was that meetings and circles were conducted in a counterclockwise fashion, whereas back home we would do this in a clockwise fashion. So even as something as simple as the direction to conduct business in, like the example I just gave, really speaks to our vast differences as within and amongst ourselves as Indigenous people. In recognition of these differences, we as helpers, we do have a duty to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our culturally diverse clients. So to further highlight our obligations, I pulled some references from the College of Registered Psychotherapists Ontario, which is my regulating body, as well as from Lorraine's regulating body with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. So CRPO has outlined the entry to practice competencies for registered psychotherapists, and it states that we have to be able to integrate knowledge of human and cultural diversity within our work with clients, meaning that we need to be able to demonstrate a proficiency in the following 4 key areas. So first, we need to be able to recognize how oppression, power, and social injustice may affect the client as well as the therapeutic process. So what this first competency does is that it really speaks to the essence of cultural safety, which we are going to talk about a little bit later in this webinar. Secondly, we must be able to adapt our approach as therapists when working with culturally diverse clients. So what this means is that we need to be able to meet the clients with where they're at, while also being very mindful of their specific cultural needs. Third, it is important to identify and minimize barriers that may affect access to therapeutic services. So a good example of a barrier is offering a certain amount of counseling sessions per client without regarding what the presenting issues may be. So those of us that work in trauma, we know that it can be really challenging to work with complex trauma in particular within 3 to 6 sessions, depending on what agency you work for. And also we recognize in post-secondary institutions that our students are very busy. So we need to be able to ensure that we are adapting our services to fit their specific needs. And even as Indigenous counselors, this is something that both Lorraine and I encounter as well. Sometimes our students don't always want to see the Indigenous counselor. And some reasons for that may be because they feel like they know us too much because we're part of the Indigenous community within our institutions. So they would actually feel more comfortable talking to a more mainstream counselor. So again, it's really about ensuring that we are able to identify what those services are. And that brings me to my next point, which is that we must be able to identify both the resources in the community as well as culturally relevant resources. So for Indigenous students, this means not only knowing who the Indigenous counselor is, where they can find the Indigenous lounge or the department, as well as the services that department offers. But this also includes being able to identify the Indigenous agencies within the community that your institution resides in, and building relationships with the Indigenous helpers of those particular agencies. And then to look at a second regulating body with the OCSW SSW within their standards of practice. One of these standards of practice is that college members must be knowledgeable and sensitive to cultural and ethnic diversity and to the forms of social injustice such as poverty, discrimination, and imbalances of power that exist in the culture and that affects the clients. Again, this particular standard of practice is very much in line with the practice of cultural safety, which is becoming an emerging standard and competency for us in order to practice as healthcare practitioners.
So in addition to population growth and our codes of ethics and standards of practice, the third reason why we're looking at Indigenous mental health today is due to the impact and influence of the outcomes from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided a roadmap for establishing new, mutually respectful relationships between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The 94 calls to action, released in 2015, highlighted the important role of education in the reconciliation process and urged all levels of government, the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal, to work together to change policies and programs in a concerted effort to repair the historical and current harms while moving forward with reconciliation. In March of this year, Ontario colleges conducted a survey to review how the sector is responding to these TRC calls to action. It revealed that, not surprisingly, colleges are at varying stages in addressing the recommendations, but reflect significant changes are underway. So that's good news. It also identified that all colleges have a dedicated counselor for Indigenous students, and many have additional supports, including access to elders, sharing circles, peer tutoring, traditional medicines, and dedicated bursaries. So now we have a request for you. With this in mind, we ask you, has your department crafted a plan for supporting or servicing Indigenous students? If you could reflect your response, either yes, fully implemented, yes, partially implemented, yes, it's in the formulation phase, not sure, or no, not to my knowledge. We would appreciate your efforts. We're just waiting for the poll results to populate.
Okay, so I've stopped the poll now, and you should see the results coming up on your screen right now. Do you see it?
I don't.
Oh, it's 20% for yes, fully implemented, 25% for yes, partially implemented, 23% for yes in the formulation phase, 20% not sure, and 13% no, not to my knowledge.
So pretty equitable numbers there, 25, 20, 23. So pretty balanced in terms of the different responses. Congrats to those who, yes, have something fully implemented. That's impressive. And it sounds like the vast majority are on the right path in terms of being in the formulation plan, having it partially implemented or fully implemented. So that's great to hear, and kudos to all of you.
Yes, thank you everybody for sharing where your college is at in terms of implementing a plan to responding to the calls to action. It's really neat to see kind of where everyone is in their journey. So thank you for sharing more about that. So on this slide here, what we're going to be talking about emerging themes. And in preparation for this webinar, Lorraine and I really wanted to be able to focus on some specific issues that Indigenous students come across that address as their concerns, but that we may not necessarily see with non-Indigenous students. And the reason why we wanted to do that was to particularly highlight those culturally diverse needs with our Indigenous students, and just to drive even more the importance of being able to recognize those issues and being able to adapt to their specific needs. So what in our conversations about this, we identified 5 specific needs as emergent themes within our counseling practice when it comes to working with Indigenous students. So the first one that we identified was identity, and this is an incredibly common but also very complex conversation to have with Indigenous students. And the reason for that is the fact that many Indigenous students who aren't exposed to their culture at all, or any Indigenous culture at all, when they come into post-secondary. And even those students who carry knowledge about their own culture often experience conflict when they're trying to maintain their cultural integrity, as well as trying to understand themselves as Indigenous peoples, while trying to obtain an education within a westernized institution that may conflict with those values. Secondly, complex trauma in particular is unfortunately a very common issue amongst our students. So often our role as counselors is to support the students, and I'm talking about any post-secondary students, with navigating present-day stressors simply just because they're in college or university. But with Indigenous students, we're also navigating the complexities and layers of intergenerational trauma, colonial trauma, and historic trauma. And these are some of the things that they're holding to, in addition to just feeling the normal stressors of being a post-secondary student. So by being able to understand the history of colonization in Canada and its impacts on Indigenous peoples, you can begin to pinpoint where some of these traumas stem from. And this is including from the residential school system, the 60s scoop, racism, discrimination, healthcare inequities, and colonial systems that are set up to directly or indirectly assimilate Indigenous peoples, such as the Indian Act. And the traumas of these historical events continue to be very relevant and contemporary issues that our Indigenous students are holding on to in varying degrees of impact. And one of the ways that our students continue to feel the effects of those traumas are through grief and loss. So for example, there are very disproportionate rates of suicide amongst Indigenous peoples. The national average is actually 5 times higher for Indigenous peoples in Canada compared to non-Indigenous peoples. And this is even higher for our Inuit communities, at 11 times higher than the national rate. However, our students also experience grief in other ways, through the loss of parenting, loss of identity, as well as loss of connection to their community or culture as a direct result of colonization, as well as racist assimilation policies and legislation. Another concern that our students often bring to the counseling room is with navigating cultural collisions. And I was talking a bit about that earlier when I was talking about identity. So essentially what this means is that oftentimes our values and our ideologies as Indigenous peoples are in direct conflict with the values of a westernized post-secondary institution. So a good example of this is the fact that many Indigenous communities are typically very collective and holistic in nature, where the community's well-being is equally important and connected to the individual's well-being, and vice versa. So, for example, if you had a student who experienced a death of a member of their community and needed to miss a test to travel home in order to attend that funeral, the student may be told that they will receive a 0 on that test if that professor is looking at those students' needs from a Western lens, simply because they're missing a test for a relative who is not blood related. Lastly, an emergent theme that could commonly occur with when working with Indigenous students is with regards to their own spirituality. And with Indigenous students and within our communities, spiritual health is paid as equal attention as you would to physical, emotional, and mental health. So our role as counselors are to be able to support the student with defining and exploring their own sense of their spirituality. So now these are just a few examples, but when navigating the issues that students bring to the counseling room, we need to be able to utilize that cultural lens in addition to our Western lens in order to ensure that we are giving those students the best support possible.
So given these realities, how do we as counselors or support people just enable ourselves as well as creating environments that can best lend support to the students that we serve? So one way that we do that is through a concept that Jamie and I use, and it was coined originally by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in 2004, and it is Edawaptimuk, which is also known as two-eyed seeing. So this idea of Edawaptimuk is that we learn to see from one eye from the perspective of the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing. And we learn to see from the other eye the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing. The goal being that we, in time, can utilize both eyes together in tandem for the benefit of all. And by facilitating the development of our weaker eye, we are thus able to better facilitate services and supports to the Indigenous students. So today what we are offering is in the gesture of creating a new lens for those who are seeking to strengthen their Indigenous eye so that we can have clear vision as we move forward.
And just to add to that, I would also like to acknowledge that Albert's wife, Merdina Marshall, was also very instrumental in sharing and teaching us with the teachings of two-eyed seeing. And Merdina, unfortunately, just passed away very recently. So we just want to express gratitude for the teachings that she has left us and how the legacy that she has left through the work of two-eyed seeing. So miigwech Merdina, miigwech Albert. So earlier I had mentioned that Indigenous communities are very collective in nature. So when working with Indigenous clients, we need to begin to think about our Indigenous students in terms of their well-being and their success as post-secondary students with the lens that reflects their values and ways of being as Indigenous peoples. So the diagram on the slide is an Indigenous holistic framework created by Dr. Michelle Pidgeon of Simon Fraser University that provides guiding principles to ensuring that post-secondary institutions become accessible, inclusive, safe, and successful places for Indigenous students. So what that means for us as helpers is that those of us who support Indigenous post-secondary students need to be able to recognize the significance of the students' relationships with their peers, their family, their community, and their nation, and all of creation in order to really appreciate the value of the whole student. And this diagram here really gives us a visual aid of what that looks like. And so when we look at outside the diagram, so referring to our role models, our elders, the value of interconnectedness, as well as sharing food, the value of holism, being able to implement cultural safety in every single thing that we do when we're working with our students, being able to appreciate their sense of spirituality, being completely genuine and authentic and transparent with our students, and even using humor and humility, the use of circles, the use of ceremonies, and being able to manage all this by balancing and doing this in a very harmonious way. These are the types of teachings and ways of knowing that we can begin to implement within our counseling practice.
So we've referenced a few times through this presentation the concept of cultural safety. And this might be familiar to some of you out there, and to others it may be less familiar. So for those of you who this may be a new concept for, it was part of Irapeti Ramsden's research. She was a Maori nurse back in the 1980s, and she recognized that cultural competency didn't fully encompass the realities of the experiences of Indigenous peoples intersecting with non-Indigenous healthcare providers. So a huge part of her life was in conducting this research and formulating this understanding of cultural safety. So essentially, cultural safety takes the components of cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competency, so having knowledge and sensitivity and awareness of the other, but overlaying that with an understanding of the socio-political context that individuals may carry with them. So for many Indigenous populations across the world, they encounter colonialism and oppression and imbalances of power throughout the course of their lives, and for many, through many generations. And in trying to rebalance that, this effort to create culturally safe environments is basically in the spirit of rectifying those imbalances. So as a culturally safe practitioner, you would, through that Indigenous lens, recognize those potential power imbalances, the potential influences of historical colonization and oppression, and that will help inform the work that you do with the individuals you are aligning with. So when we look at promoting culturally safe spaces, we often get, well, how do you do that? So the first is educating and informing yourself about what cultural safety is, and then how do we translate that into the environments that we inhabit in our day-to-day professions. So through indigenizing our spaces, we can do that in different ways. Some institutions are doing that through curriculum, through increased Indigenous faculty or staff, instructors, through also transforming learning spaces and service spaces. So many institutions now have Indigenous lounges or Indigenous gathering spaces, and all of those elements are aligned with this idea of indigenizing our institutions. For those of us who may sit in an office most of the day, one of the things that I have noticed recently, and I had shared this with Jamie, was we have an intake form that students will complete prior to coming in for service. And one of the questions on that intake form is whether they identify as First Nation, Métis, or Inuit, or having ancestry of either of those denominations. And I found it interesting that I would be seeing an individual in walk-in, so I've never met them before. And they may not have checked off that box on the intake form. But as our session unfolds, they begin disclosing ancestry. So a grandmother who's Mi'kmaq, a father who is Métis, but who, hasn't followed the traditional ways. And as I started to acknowledge this phenomenon, I started to wonder, why is that? Why are they not checking it off on the form? but once they're in session, they're freely divulging this information. So I began to ask what enabled them to share that information with me. And what I learned was that as they sat in my space and they looked around, and as you can see behind me on my walls, there is lots of artwork and different artifacts that I have gained over the years, gifts from former students. And it enabled them to acknowledge a part of their life, a part of their ancestry that they typically don't share. So there is power in indigenizing the spaces that we exist in, and it is a nonverbal way of conveying that we are receptive to hearing those stories and that information about them. So another thing that we can do as practitioners is create service structures and spaces which reflect awareness of and sensitivity to these Indigenous histories and cultures and traditions. So that can be conveyed through posters on the walls about services that are coming up in the institution. It can be having a smudge bowl available should someone choose to smudge, or having smudge-friendly environments, which is ideal, but not always possible. And really demonstrating that we're open to and inviting to hear their voices. As well, it's so important for us as practitioners to recognize the influence of colonization, both historically and in present day, to acknowledge the dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression, and how those interface with individuals in their day-to-day lives. For us, under our code of ethics, we have a responsibility to advocate for change and advocate for change in the workplace. So if we become aware of barriers or practices that are misaligned with what we know to be culturally safe, then we have a responsibility to advocate for change in that area. Also, it's important to build relationships with those around us. It can be with the Indigenous service providers, with our students, and with others in the broader community. And through doing that, we build our allyship with the Indigenous peoples. Lastly, disrupting this idea that Indigenous ways of knowing are somehow subordinate to dominant Western ways of knowing. And when we acknowledge that there is equal validity to these alternate ways of knowing, considering the role that elders, traditional knowledge keepers, and ceremony can play in supporting our students and their path to wellness. So working with Indigenous student services to ensure that you're following protocols and are supporting respectful relationships with elders and traditional knowledge keepers, or in pursuing ceremonial practices, understanding offering of tobacco and the appropriate honorariums, that would be recommended. And recognizing that we all have specific roles and responsibilities in ensuring our Indigenous students are not only safe, but thriving. So lastly, I want to recognize and emphasize that it's important to honor your own personal gifts that you bring to that intersection with others, that you lend these spaces that gift that you carry with you and foster those relationships. So don't diminish what you bring to that space and that environment, because it is equally as valuable and valid. Our medicine wheel teachings reflect all nations, recognizing that each is necessary for balance and harmony to exist amongst us. Our belief in interconnectedness reminds us we are all related. Let's join together in fostering culturally safe spaces and Eruaptamuk. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine and Jamie. That was great.
Berlin, I don't think we can hear you. And we also have some resources we wanted to share as well, if we could just take another couple minutes.
Yes, of course. Go ahead. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I keep forgetting to unmute.
Thank you. That's okay. So on behalf of Lorraine and myself, we just really wanted to say miigwech nyawa to our listeners for tuning into this webinar, as well as to the organizers of CICMH for inviting us to facilitate today's webinar. Lorraine and I have combined a couple of resources that we'd like to share with you. And we were very particular about the resources that we picked because in the spirit of cultural safety, when we actually look at what cultural safety means, it's an ongoing reflection and development of your self-awareness with regards to the relationships that you're building with your clients and how your privileges and advantages are influencing the counseling room and therefore influencing how safe that student feels. So the resources that we collected for you that we're going to be presenting, and I'm going to highlight a few of them, are really to encourage you to begin that journey of self-reflection, to be able to unfold those layers of privilege that we may bring to the counseling room. So the first one is some further teachings about two-eyed seeing from the Institute for Integrative Science and Health. And you can actually find a video with Elder Albert Marshall as well as Murdina Marshall talking more about, sharing more teachings about two-eyed seeing on that website. The second is the Indigenous Cultural Safety Collaborative, which is often a resource I often refer to from time and time again. And this is a series of free webinars on cultural safety that really dive down deep into several topics related to this, or several crucial topics that you need to focus on, such as racism, privilege, and social determinants of health. And these webinars are being offered by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and practitioners. The third is a series of learning guides created by the Indigenization Project in British Columbia on the indigenization of post-secondary institutions. And the series was created to support the systemic change occurring across post-secondary institutions. So those of you who are feeling like you're not quite sure or there isn't a lot happening with regards to responding to the TRC calls to actions, this is a really great guide to be able to begin facilitating those discussions. And there's a series of different learning guides for frontline workers, for managers, for administrators, faculty, you name it. Because again, we all have a role to play when it comes to indigenization, decolonization, and ultimately reconciliation. But however, and Lorraine had already mentioned this, but I cannot emphasize enough the most important resource that you have are with the Indigenous communities and organizations that are located near your institutions. So if you don't know who they are, the first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is to identify who those Indigenous peoples are in your area and what nations they represent, as well as the cultural resources that are available to you that you can begin to refer students to. But in the spirit of reconciliation, I cannot emphasize further the importance of building relationships with those communities and organizations. So it is, again, a big miigwech, nyawa for having us, and then we'd like to answer any questions that you may have. I know Lorraine and I were just talking right before the webinar how her and I are not very good on webinar, that we prefer to engage with our audience and build relationships. Again, very Indigenous way of doing things. So excited for some of the questions that you guys have. Miigwech.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And for people who claim to not be very good on webinars, I think you did an excellent job. That was amazing. So thank you so much. And just a reminder to our audience, if you want to send in any questions, you can use the question function on the menu. So just type in those questions and I'll read them out to our lovely presenters. So as we're just kind of waiting for questions to roll in here, I have a question for you. When you mention advocating for change, I'm curious in what, how do you mean advocating for change? In what ways and how do you do that? And in your experience, when you've been doing that, have you encountered any resistance at your organizations?
So sometimes I have encountered situations within the organization. For example, some of the processes could be through human resources. They're very westernized processes. So many colleges or institutions have policies and procedures around student rights and responsibilities. And sometimes, as opposed to a very top-down, authoritative, punitive kind of approach, we have advocated to have a circle process, so that we can have members come together who have been impacted by a particular incident and do more of a restorative process, as opposed to the typical, and that's not something that prior to us advocating for that security, and the college shows that they've never done that before, and it's not something they would typically do. So it did take us advocating for it to invite the consideration and then ultimately the practice. And similarly with some of the processes around harassment and discrimination, there are sometimes alternative ways of doing things that aren't considered as a standard practice. So sometimes we have to advocate and see those as opportunities for learning and growing within an institution.
Thank you. Jamie, do you have anything to add?
No, I just have to echo what Lorraine says, that often, our values as Indigenous peoples, and even just our protocols and way of doing things can really conflict or be in direct conflict with the way that the Western institution operates. And of course, when conflict happens, resistance can naturally occur. And that's why, I really stress the importance of building relationships with the Indigenous staff and faculty in the communities of your institutions, because it's really important to be able to feel safe enough to open up a conversation. Sometimes it's just about exploring alternative ways to bring in Indigenous ways of living, of knowing, of healing, but also that often opens up the conversation to be able to, especially for our non-Indigenous folks, to be able to situate themselves and begin to question, it's like, why do we have to do things that way? And really to unpack that colonial lens as well.
I could add another example. Unless you have another question, I can lend another example. Perlin, do you have another question there? Okay.
I mean, we do, but we have tons of time, so.
So recently on our listserv, on the Ontario College Counsellors listserv, a question was posed around a student who identifies hearing voices of dead people for some time, and since they were a young child, and some grappling with how do we understand this. And I really respected that individuals felt comfortable and safe in putting it out there and asking the question and looking for differing opinions on this. And certainly from an Indigenous lens, this may be that individual's gift, that this is something that they have a capacity to do that is not pathological. But oftentimes through a Western lens, we would see potential pathology there. So it really is, looking at some of those more nuanced situations and and learning more about the individual to understand that more fully.
That's a great point. Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions rolling in, and one of that is just kind of apropos of the last question about advocating for change. Do you have any resources to support making changes to policies and processes within the organization regarding smudging, such as fire policies and procedures?
We do at Fleming. Do you, Jamie?
This is something that we're continuing to have conversations in order to evolve, because as of right now, we're only able to smudge. So we have 2 campuses here at Niagara College, and only in one of the, we have 2 lounges at both campuses, but only in one of them are we able to smudge freely. So this is a conversation that our department is continuing to have. So I know, Lorraine, you have lots to say on this one.
Yeah, so under the human rights, we do have the right, because it is a ceremonial traditional practice, but if there is a competing human right, so if someone within that same environment has a sensitivity or an allergy, then never in our way of being and doing things do we want to inflict harm on another. So it's really, again, going through a process to understand, can we come up with a mutually respectful resolution to this? But I know even Fleming College went through quite a process with the fire chief here at one of our campuses around our ceremonial fire in our teepee. So we had to go through quite a process in terms of building an understanding, because oftentimes it is that people don't understand necessarily what smudging is, what's involved in it, what challenges it may present, and different ways around that as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. So next question. I would like to know if the same tips you shared, and I'm assuming these are the tips about creating safe spaces, could be applied as well in a workspace where a significant amount of the workforce is Indigenous, as well as do you have any tips to share to help to harmonize work relationships? So this is a little bit out of the post-secondary environment. We're talking about workspaces.
I would say that's an ongoing challenge, indigenizing spaces in general, which include our workspaces. And I still think, and this is a very personal opinion, I think that we have a lot of educating to do. I know that I frequently hear from individuals about that sense of marginalization. That even when there may be a number of you, you still may not be the majority. So absolutely those same ideas in terms of creating culturally safe spaces would apply, but oftentimes I think it's really building the relationships, and depending on what the dynamics are, there may need to be a deeper intervention happening there to build those safe team spaces.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's really about building those relationships and also being able to identify the specific needs of those specific indigenous peoples, and what that really speaks to, again, going back to that we all have very different and vast needs. We can't assume one size fits all kind of mentality when working with our community. So we have to, being able to have those conversations is incredibly essential and important. And also, just to speak from a philosophical sense, in order to be able to indigenize spaces, which essentially by indigenizing, you're also allowing for reconciliation to happen, we have to be able to decolonize our spaces. And that should be the very first and foremost thing that we need to do in order to be able to begin to bring in our cultural teachings, because our teachings have to be able to thrive within the space that we're working in.
I think that is one of the areas of where there's a lot of challenge, because oftentimes there's just a lack of awareness that structures or practices are colonized practices. So it's creating those safe conversations to start to unpack some of those components, because a lot of times it's not, it's not individuals who are purposely, setting out to cause harm or it's just these systems and these structures have emerged over the course of time, but from a very colonized perspective. So, deconstructing those takes time and energy and patience.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not going to happen overnight. Our next question is, we do not currently ask students as part of our intake process about their ethnicity or ancestry. Would you recommend this?
You want me to speak to part of that, Jamie, or do you want to?
Sure. Okay, we're so eager to answer your questions, folks. I was just going to say that I think it depends on the reason why you're asking. Like if you're asking for numbers to be able to begin to identify who your students are, absolutely, right? And just like in the counseling room, you have to be able to know the right questions to ask, because the questions that you ask are going to get the answers that you're looking for.
So what I was going to say is, when I first started at Fleming almost 10 years ago, we weren't asking that question. And we had, numbers of identified students that were like low 20s, 30s, and we were like, this is not jiving with who we understand we're working with. When we began to ask the question, our numbers began to grow. And it wasn't, I don't think that we were getting more Indigenous students, it's just that we were asking the question. And when we would explain to them why we were asking the question, because we wanted to understand how much of our population is Indigenous, and use that as a platform to advocate for additional services and resources and supports. Now we have a question in our intake at Fleming that actually asks if they would like to share anything that would be helpful for us in getting to know them better around whether it's culture, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, spirituality. So we ask a very broad question, and I'm always very intrigued with, sometimes people don't fill that in at all, and other times people do, and it's so robust, some of those responses, and it really does give you insight into the individual that you are sitting with. So I would absolutely encourage inviting that conversation. And I think the question does invite the conversation.
I feel like if there is one takeaway from everything that we've talked about today, is encourage conversation.
Absolutely.
But also to listen as well. To have a conversation also means you have to listen to the other person.
Absolutely. Yeah. So next question is, I guess, a question for me, actually. We have someone who says, we would love if CICMH could develop a list of Indigenous counselors at Ontario universities and colleges. It would be nice if clinicians could have more connections with their counterparts at other institutions, as often there's only one in each school. Is that something that, you guys would be open to if we were to start sort of a small community practice of people across Ontario?
We did that previously through the Ontario College Counsellors.
Okay.
But and that's when I was the representative, but now Jamie is the representative. But I think I would love to have a community of practice, personally.
So, sorry, I guess I'm not sure. Do you mean there's already something like that?
Well, there's not a community. Well, what we tried to, so we had a list. We did generate a list. But weren't very overly successful, and I don't know if you've had greater success, Jamie, in terms of creating that community of practice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't gotten much further on that. So what I've been trying to focus on is more so identifying and situating myself on where I am on the, because I'm currently sitting on the Ontario College Counsellors Executive Committee as the Indigenous rep, and it's really just to situate myself and say, okay, here I am. My name is Jamie. I'm Mishkegwig Cree, and it's beginning to showcase who I am and to open that door. So, unfortunately, we haven't gotten a lot of success in terms of identifying who our counselors are. But I know both myself and Lorraine are always wanting to be able to connect with our Indigenous counselors. So, I guess to answer the question is that has come into place, but I think it definitely needs to continue to evolve as our institutions are constantly evolving as well.
That's amazing. And are you connected with, because it's the Ontario College Counselors, are you connected with counselors at universities then? Indigenous counselors?
Not specifically, no. Like we do have a specific membership that would allow for other members to be able to join the OCC, but directly connected to Indigenous communities, no.
Okay,
But
so
I would
maybe
love
there's a
to be a
little bit of
part of
space there and
that.
opportunity for, yeah, Indigenous counselors at universities to be connected with the ones at colleges.
Absolutely, and I think there's a huge opportunity there to create that community of practice. I think
I
that
agree.
would be most welcome.
I
That's
agree.
You go,
excellent.
go, girl, go.
What happens when you start asking the right questions?
No, that's excellent. Okay, so moving on to the next couple of questions. So this question is, I don't have a question, but please say hello to Lorraine. It's a former client of yours that helped her about 10 years ago. So it's pleasantly surprised to see you today. So just a shout out and hello to
Oh,
Lorraine.
wow. Lovely. Hello, whoever you are.
It's Amy.
Oh, wow. Okay. Fantastic. Hi, Amy.
And on that note, I just want to say hi to my mom. She's watching right now. Of course, had to have her mom watch. Hi, Mama.
And so just probably have time for maybe just a little bit more. We actually had some follow up to the smudging question. So, in regards to smudging, if we are not allowed to smudge in different classrooms, then in the past I have used cedar water. This might help as well. So somebody is kind of giving their experience on smudging.
Absolutely. That's great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know that's something that we definitely use in our at one of our campuses here in the lounge there, that we've used sage and cedar water that was actually created by our visiting elder here, and again, that's just a reflection of another alternative option to be able to bring Indigenous ways of doing things into the post-secondary space as well. So thank you for that suggestion. That's great.
Mm-hmm. And again, with regards to smudging, UIT in Oshawa had to go through similar conversations regarding smudging and the fire department. So they're just wondering if you had any specific resources to support this process, like links to maybe templates or anything.
Oh, we can see what we can find and send them to you, Perlin.
Yeah, so send them to me and I'll be happy to distribute to really all of anyone who's attended the
Okay.
webinar. If you
Yeah.
had kind of documents, process, anything that you've used in your own process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Yes, and I think last question that we have time for is, will there be other webinars similar to this one in the near future? Well, I would love to. It depends if our speakers would want to would have more to say on it. Is this something that you feel like you could elaborate on, that make a deeper dive?
This was but this is our pioneer voyage with webinars, right? So yeah, I'm totally open to that. If Jamie is, but yeah, in terms of send in your requests in terms of what you'd like to learn more about, and we absolutely could do a deeper dive.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
absolutely. I completely echo this. I would be totally open to this opportunity. And yeah, if our listeners have anything specific they would like to know more about, please share them with Perlin. And maybe from that we can begin to have a conversation of exploring what topics that we could offer you guys. Miigwech.
Perfect. And also a shout out to everyone who is attending the webinar. I'm sure a lot of you are also practitioners with your own practice. And if you have something to share, this is we're very welcome to hear it. So please shoot me an email, and we'd definitely be happy to explore this topic in the near future. Yeah. And so again, thank you so much, Jamie and Lorraine. I also have like a bunch of, well, not questions, but shout outs and thank yous from our audience actually, such as much gratitude. That was very helpful. Thank you so much. So I think this webinar was very, very, very helpful to people. So thank you so much
Awesome.
for sharing your knowledge and your practice.
Thanks, Perlin. You
That's
helped
wonderful.
us pull it off without a hitch.
There were no issues.
That's awesome. Yay.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Miigwech.